Right, everybody. Welcome to our live broadcast and discussion today on X and also on YouTube. I want to welcome our audience, and I'm really excited about today's discussion. My name is David Leis, and I'm your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier. So we're glad that you could join us. Today, I'm going to welcome a special guest back again, Barbara Kay, columnist and author, great analyst. And so a warm welcome to you, Barbara.
Thanks for having me, David. It's great to be here.
Well, Barbara, it's great to have you because I'm sure that we're going to get a number of questions from our audience. We just released this week a discussion that we had on Leaders on the Frontier, and if you haven't seen it as an audience, I encourage you to review it. We'd welcome your comments and your feedback as we welcome your chat, and be sure to like us and subscribe to our newsletters. We certainly really appreciate really the hundreds of comments we receive on programs, and it's really amazing the kind of enthusiasm we've received um, to the program. In fact, just the other week, we broke the 50 barrier with the podcast in terms of popularity in the news category in Canada. So we're pleased, and that's all because of our audience. And so be sure to keep sharing and liking what we're doing. We really do appreciate it. So, Barbara, we had, I think, an extraordinary conversation. We covered an awful lot. Our theme was kind of picking up on revelations coming out of October 7, the horrendous terrorism attack by Hamas on Israel, and the death and destruction out of that. It's really been quite a story as it's unfolded. And it's hard to believe that that was on October 7th. So, that effort continues, and we basically kind of got into a variety of topics, whether it was from wokeism to universities. Um, so I found it a very interesting discussion. So I did want to pick up on some of those threads because we talked a lot about, um, if I had to characterize it, truth telling around different topics. And so out of October 7, out of that horrendous tragedy, it is a very interesting time as we talk about this on February the 15th, the day after Valentine's Day. We talk about what's happening now in Gaza and the continued war by Israeli Defense Forces on Hamas. I think we're kind of in a critical countdown as
Mhm.
we look at how they have done an incredible job at rooting out Hamas, literally out of the hundreds of miles of tunnels underneath Gaza that has been built. And so, through that whole system, where are we at now, from your point of view, Barbara, when it comes to looking at this tragedy and the historic moment that we're at now today, as Israel looks at kind of completing the destruction of Hamas?
Well, the situation is that yes, Israel is still very much committed to having a total victory. Uh, Needless to say,
Hmm.
there's been quite a bit of pushback to that. There's been less pushback than might have been expected because the civilian casualty rate is going down because the campaign is now highly targeted and very precise. So you're not having massive bombing raids or anything like that, and uh, they are very committed to that. But you're still having people in the West demanding a ceasefire kind of as an automatic thing. This has gone on long enough, or there's too many people dying. These comments are not helpful
Hmm.
because they what they're really saying is don't destroy Hamas entirely. They're
Hmm.
actually saying we'd be more comfortable if you'd stop. Uh, but they have to understand that if Israel stops now, when they have their ultimate goal in view, this is going to be end up, uh, playing the same game again,
Hmm.
letting them get back to a certain strength, and then their goal is the same as ever to eradicate Israel. They're not going to stop. So
Yeah.
The situation is I would say, um, very much Israel's to control, and their aim is to, and they are proceeding very well to, they've eliminated about half of the terrorists, either by killing them or they have a huge number in custody from those that they have taken as prisoners. They are obviously receiving a great deal of intelligence, which has allowed them to home in on certain buildings or certain tunnels. And one of the great finds was to discover the command center of Hamas. I suppose they got that from information that they got from a prisoner. So that has actually, I think, quieted down a lot of criticism because people see it. They see now what they've got, and it's not pretty.
Right. Okay, so to be clear from your perspective, Barbara, the critical mission that Israel really began with day one, the day after October 7, e.g., on October 8, is their number one mission is to eradicate Hamas,
Mhm.
to take them out, period. And that mission has not changed, and they're now in the final stage of doing that. So this is a really important time. So why would our foreign minister call for a ceasefire at this time? This is where the mission needs to be completed. Otherwise, the risk to Israel is really unacceptable, is it not? That this terrorism attack would just happen again.
I agree with you that it is critical to Israel, but I'd also probably agree with you that for our foreign affairs minister, what Israel needs for its own security is not uppermost in her mind. Uh, I think this is almost a rote kind of thing. We need a ceasefire. Peace is better than war. It's that superficial, and we shouldn't forget that on October 6th, the day before the pogrom, a ceasefire was in uh, there was a ceasefire actually supposedly in place, which had been abrogated anyways. I mean, Hamas has abrogated every single ceasefire that has ever been called. So it's almost meaningless to call for a ceasefire when you're dealing with people who have no respect for international law or rules or anything like that. I think that the good that will be done by eliminating
Okay,
value.
so sorry, could you repeat that last point, Barbara?
I think that eradicating Hamas, the value in doing so, uh, very much transcends any value that there could be in a ceasefire. The only value would be in the optics of, oh, good, there's nobody's dying. So that's not good enough. If Hamas really is eliminated, then we can look at the day after, then we can look at rebuilding, we can look at all kinds of other options. But for me, the value is not only in elimination of an existential threat on a fragile border, but also in the message that it sends to other Iran proxies like Hezbollah, the Houthis, or whoever else is thinking, now it's our turn to attack. I think it's very important that they see the determination, and they've poked the bear too many times, and this time the bear, you know, is making sure the nests of hornets are cleared out.
Well, it certainly has been a very difficult conflict, war for everybody, but it's part of the reality of war, um, and the reality of how do you deal with terrorism today? Like,
Mhm.
how do you hold a ceasefire with terrorists who have a religious mindset, a war to eliminate and commit genocide on not just Israel but Jewish people? It is really quite a difficult reality to put one's head around, isn't it?
It is. We thought we knew what you do with terrorists when it was Islamic State. We certainly did not have people protesting in the streets when Americans went in to eliminate Islamic State. Um, the Battle of Mosul, which took 4 months in Iraq, and many more disproportionate. I mean, the proportions of civilians killed to terrorists was much higher than in Gaza, and they didn't even have underground tunnels. So nobody protested then because they understood that it really was Islamic State was a terrorist group. Somehow, because Hamas is embedded in an actual territory, I mean, where they are the nominal leaders of that territory, this is now a fungible kind of term. And you get our media, the CBC doesn't call them terrorists, they call them militants. I don't know that, but we've lost that moral clarity around the fact that they are terrorists first, and political leaders second, if at all, because they have really not exercised any of the practices or responsible action that one associates with political leadership in an actual in a place that says that it's ready to become a state. It's not
Yeah,
exactly practicing for statehood.
exactly. I do have a question from the audience, and speaking of the audience, I'm talking with renowned columnist and author Barbara Kay. So we welcome your questions. And one of the questions is, why is the United Nations involved with Hamas?
That's okay. That's a very good question. After the Palestinians are unique in the world for having, once they became refugees after a war that was started by the Arabs against Israel on the day that it declared statehood. Uh, 5 Arab armies descended on the fledgling state. To everyone's shock and surprise, Israel did win that war. But in the meantime, during that war, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had left thinking that they were going to come back when the Arabs won the war. So now they are refugees. And there were approximately, I don't know, I think there were 800,000. Um, they were refugees the same as in other parts of the world, numberless states. There have been wars where certain ethnic groups have fled from strife, and they are all handled by one group in the United Nations called the United Nations Refugee Agency. But for the Palestinians, they created a brand new agency called UNRWA, United Nations Relief Works. Is it what is it? United Nations uh, Relief Works Agency. And uniquely amongst all the refugees in the world, the Palestinians were all other refugees are considered refugees for one generation. After that, their status has to change. They have to find themselves a position in other countries. They have to settle down. They are no longer considered refugees by the United Nations. Uniquely, Palestinians are considered refugees into the second, third, fourth, and sometimes I think now some are in the fifth generation, and they are looked after by this group, UNRWA. Most of the people that work for UNRWA are Palestinians. They are teachers. They're involved in health, social. They're engaged in all kinds of activities that are supposed to help the refugees. There's no reason at all why they're actually still needed, because after all these generations, they should be doing their own teaching. They should be doing their own social work. They should be preparing for statehood. But they have remained passive and dependent on an agency that is funded by so many billions of dollars. And amongst all those UNRWA groups are people that are loyal to Hamas, who know all about the tunnels, who know all about the arms stocking, and they are collaborative and complicit, and some of them are out and out fighters for Hamas when necessary. It's an extremely corrupt organization. They are complicit in teaching young children to want to become suicide bombers, to want to kill Jews. We have this all on tapes that groups like Palestinian Media Watch and Memory on camera. Um, so we've seen outtakes from the lessons they learn in school, uh, and yet we keep funding them. Canada has funded them all. I mean, United States given, I don't know, $290 million a year, crazy amounts of money. Most of it has gone to political leaders of Hamas who live in Qatar and are all built. There's four of them. Every one of them is at least three is worth 3 billion, 4 billion, $5 billion. All that money has been siphoned off from aid that has supposedly gone to help the Palestinian people. A lot of the money has gone into the tunnel making. There are billions and billions and billions of dollars that have gone into 400 kilometers of tunnels, which is longer than the London Underground. That's more mileage or kilometerage than is in the London subway system. And to think about that is kind of mind-boggling. And all of that underground is for use by Hamas members alone, not for civilians, not for use as bomb shelters. They get no benefit. Um, so that's a long story short. And UNRWA, uh, that's one of the objectives, I think, of Israel, and it should be for all of us. This group has to end. There's no need for it. They can be helped by the World Health Organization, by all the things, all the humanitarian work that is needed in Gaza can be accomplished by groups, UN agencies that are already doing exactly the same thing elsewhere. Why can't they do it in Gaza too? So that's a question that hangs over this whole situation and has to be dealt with after the war is over.
No, I think that's a brilliant summation, Barbara. It is stunning what you've summarized in terms of the malfeasance, the corruption. It's like a rat's nest of how the UN, this particular agency, has been really, its mission has been compromised and really not serving anybody except itself and Hamas leadership and the cause of terrorism, and ironically not really serving the people of Gaza. And so, it begs a lot of serious questions around where to go from here, as you said, with that agency and also our own government. Like under this um, recent administration, we've been actually funding that organization again because I think that
Yeah.
the previous administration ended its funding because it recognized the corruption involved and how it was not on mission anymore. And so, why did we decide to fund it again? I don't understand this, Barbara. What's your take on that?
Because they're working on the assumption, I mean, the assumption that they've been given by Hamas and by the UN is, oh no, if we the UNRWA is they know the system. They're the only ones that can produce the kind of aid that is necessary. It may be true that right now in the middle of the war, you can't actually kick them all out and but you can start the process of legitimizing them. And I should have added the most important thing that's wrong with UNRWA is that by um, by counting as refugees people in the second, third, fourth generation, UNRWA has is endorsing the idea that they are going back. They have this fantasy that not only are the original refugees, I think there's about 30,000 of them left, um, not only are they going back, but the now 5.6 million people, Palestinians, that are now constitute, in the West Bank and the 2 million in Gaza, they're going back too. This is the greatest delusion in history. They are not going back, but by nourishing that delusion, which UNRWA does, they are encouraging what they call acts of resistance instead of in keeping people's minds focused on, look, you're not going back. We have to build a society here that convinces the world that we can operate as a viable state. That when other countries, before they were states, when other countries have applied for statehood, one of their main talking points is, look at what we've accomplished without a state. We have a functioning education system. We have a functioning bureaucracy. We have a functioning this, functioning that, and we are ready to take the reins to go our own way independently. We won't need your help. This these entities, the Palestinian Authority and Gaza, are mired in dysfunction because their sole raison d'etre is waiting. They're waiting with their fake keys, like they make these big keys to their old homes. They pass them down through the generations for when they're going back. So they're all dreaming, they're all fantasizing, and meanwhile, instead of building a society, they're encouraging their children to become warriors and suicide bombers. And I've personally seen many videos of mothers talking to interviewers. One I just saw yesterday. She's saying to the interview, "Why do we have so many children? Because we need them to become suicide bombers." Literally, she said that, and to give their lives as martyrs for this is what Allah wants from us. I don't know how you can talk about a two-state solution if your neighbors, if this is the mindset of the people who are living 10 miles away from you.
Well, this is a very humbling kind of situation. Its complexity is astounding in its history. But I think that you rightly turn to, like, beyond mission one, which is to take out Hamas and its corrupt leadership. The second question is, yes, as you say, what is there to be done in terms of establishing a self-governing state that
Mhm.
would be viable? So there is a question from the audience, and the question has to do with: do you think? Pardon me, I'm just getting the question here. Can a newly established state in Gaza collaborate with our federal government to develop and implement its own currency and thereby ensuring a future social cohesion within its own borders? I guess the question is really, do you have any hope that a future state can arise and that Canada could even play a role in doing that?
You know, if that individual was asking me this question about, say, the Kurds, who I think actually do deserve their own state, I would say yes. I think it could happen because they're already running a very, you know, well-functioning society. But about this place, no, I don't. I have no hope. I think it would take generational change in their understanding of who they are as a people. This is not going to happen anytime soon. It's impossible because when we talk about leadership, a different leadership from Hamas, I think perhaps the questioner has in mind a democratic kind of setup where people would vote for a new leadership. But the polls tell us that if an election were held tomorrow, something like 80% of Gazans and or 60% of 70% of Gazans and more in the Palestinian Authority would vote for Hamas. In other words, in spite of all the horrors and in spite of what Hamas has brought upon them, they they are incapable still of saying to themselves, "We need a complete change." I can tell you, Israel would never accept to anymore to negotiate any kind of a pathway to a two-state solution unless two things happen. One is that the Palestinians must recognize the legitimacy of the state of Israel and its right to be a state, which it is. I mean, it is a state, but to recognize that it is not going away and it is there legitimately. And the second thing is they have to change their educational system. If you saw the texts and what these children are indoctrinated in, they are raising generations. They've already raised generations, and they are continuing to raise children who have been inculcated with the belief that it is unacceptable for Jews to live as equals beside Muslims, and that their ultimate goal is a theocracy, a caliphate in which all Jews will be eliminated from all Muslim lands. That is in their charter, and that charter has to be, well, I mean, it won't exist after Hamas doesn't exist, if that's possible. Um, but a new charter of whoever is going to be the leader, whoever is going to be, uh, that admission alone will tell us that there's been a mind shift, a tremendous paradigm shift in the way people are thinking. But somebody has to lead that movement away from what's happening now. Who is that person? Who is that group? I don't know, because right now, anybody that suggested that, their life would be at risk.
No, I think that's a very good point, including your two conditions. Um, I would add probably a third one, which would be, is there the international leadership to ensure that we're dealing with the elephant in the room, namely that we don't continue to prop up Iran, the key actor within that region
Mhm.
who's funding Hamas and this kind of terrorism activity among many others. And as long as you have the Biden administration in, which is literally giving cash to Iran and enabling, its economic success, I think that's going to be a set of conditions that probably will not happen in the near future. But maybe I'm being too too pessimistic. Let's hope that I'm not.
Well, the US is certainly key to in all of this, and Biden is it's an election year, so both players have to make a political calculation about where support is going to be greatest. For Joe Biden, his own party is very torn on this subject, where he could count on huge support. I mean, America in general, I would say something like 90% of Americans support Israel and have always supported Israel. But if you look at, if you take a generational breakdown, you find that the younger people get, the less true that is today. And in the Democratic Party, in the category of 18 to 24-year-olds, you see a massive shift to support for uh, the Palestinian cause in general. And they're voters too. He's really between a rock and a hard place. And to speak about Trump, yes, the last time he was president, he abrogated that ridiculous treaty that is allowing them to become a nuclear power, and they're so very close to doing that. One would hope that he would go right back to that, and then of course Biden reinstated it, and that treaty really should be abrogated permanently. But that's another, I guess that's another whole question. But yes, you're right that Iran is key, and right now Iran is also making a political calculation. Uh, how much money and manpower do they want to put into this cause of eliminating Israel? They have some hard choices to make.
Indeed. Well, this has certainly been a sobering discussion on that. So during this historic time, let's stay tuned on that. And by the way, one of the comments from the audience was, with so many Palestinians in support of Hamas, it's doubtful that there'll be much change there. So, gosh, we'll stay tuned. I did want to shift the topic a little bit to what is called the province of Alberta,
Mhm.
where the other week significant legislation was introduced by the government there, and I think Daniel Smith has certainly been on the front line among other key ministers there in Alberta, introducing legislation arguably designed to protect minors from going through the process of changing their ultimately taking puberty blockers and undertaking surgery. And it also has legislation, and I encourage people to look at it, um, the whole issue of giving guidance to sports organizations in Alberta not to accept transgendered athletes, like
Mhm.
e.g., men who, quote, identify as a woman participating, say, in weightlifting or all kinds of other things where biological men have really a profound advantage over women. Um, it's interesting. I would have thought that most parents would view this as really quite middle of the road balanced legislation because they certainly have provisions to try to, safeguard people that may be transgendered, to try to respect the parental right to work with their child. Um, so, are you surprised by the reaction in some quarters, or what's your take on what's the big shakeout on this?
Well, I certainly support, Danielle Smith's initiative. I think it is balanced and fair. I think when she presented it, her video, she couldn't have been more warm and appreciative of the sensitivities around this issue and the difficulties that people with gender dysphoria have. I don't think anybody could accuse her of malice towards people who are gender confused. Certainly, that would be a very unfair accusation. So, what is she recommending? Or what are the new guidelines going to be? They are actually literally going to be the guidelines that have been imposed already by several European countries and Scandinavian countries, because those countries were kind of ahead of us in the research around this and in affirming the reality of this problem and in treatment. So they were a few years ahead. They went into it in a very big way, affirmation model and all of that, where we still are largely. But then they started doing deeper research, and they've pulled back because they're finding that the research does not support early medical intervention for sure, or even affirmation of social change uh, before a child has had really more time to go through the phases that children do. So what she is is implementing is totally consistent with what sober, responsible governments in socialist countries, like Denmark and Norway, England now, and I think is it Germany? I'm not sure, but we should be listening to those countries because they've done the research. She is listening, and in a few more years, everybody's going to be saying she was right because it is my belief that we are at a tipping point. Yes, there are very loud voices saying, "No, this is transphobic. It's not," and children are going to be devastated and they'll be depressed and they'll commit suicide. By the way, there's absolutely no research that supports the assertion by trans activists that children who are denied early affirmation or early puberty blockers or any of that commit suicide at any greater rates than children who suffer from depression, anxiety, or other disorders, uh, but that are not gender confused. So that's a red herring, and that's a bullying. That's a bully tactic. So yes, what she has done is good and strong, and it's almost like um, it's almost like this study came out just for me, knowing that I was going to be speaking with you, David. It's an absolutely brand new study by Eric Kaufman for the Macdonald Laurier Institute. It's called "The Politics of the Culture Wars in Contemporary Canada," and basically, it's the result of polls on all kinds of different issues, including the gender issue, and it shows that actually Canadians, in their views on cultural issues, are far more. They're maybe not as voluble as they are in other places, and they're more respectful of elite governmental authorities. However, when you ask them their own opinion, they are very much on side with Danielle Smith. but and they in by margins of like 2 to 1 agree that early intervention, like they should that we should err on the side of prudence, of wait and see. They do not want to see by 2 to 1. They do not want to see biological males in women's sport. If you just go down the list, they are very much. And by the way, I'm pretty sure that Mr. Polyev had access to these figures before we did, because I don't think he would have come out publicly so fast, or not so fast, but I don't think he would have been with such confidence, would have come out in support of her guidelines, unless he had a very strong understanding that by and large Canadians do agree with him.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting summary of the issue, and I'm really curious what our audience thinks about this as well. But to me, it kind of resonates. I know this is an overworked phrase, but it's kind of common sense. Like these are very significant decisions. Our heart goes out to every child who may be confused about their gender. That goes without saying. But why would that discussion be enabled with teachers? I don't understand that. That's really a parental decision. And these are decisions that are very important. They're adult decisions. They're not for minors to make. So I don't understand, what are we missing here? Like, is it
Okay, so
truly
let me play devil's advocate for 1 minute and say there could be many reasons why a child was worried or upset, or not willing to tell their parents about their gender confusion, might be afraid of their reaction, might already have advanced knowledge that this is something that they disapprove of. I personally have no problem with a child confiding in a teacher at school as their first line of, you know, advice seeking. However, the guidelines do not prohibit that at all, and I think people are confused about that. The guidelines do not deny a child the right, or deny a teacher the right, to have a private discussion about a child's distress with regard to anything. There's a difference, though, between confiding in a teacher and coming out publicly, or not publicly, but coming out in the school environment as uh, having announced that they are now a different gender. That's what is, without the parents' knowledge. That is where the guidelines draw the line. They say, no, 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 no. A teacher can privately have knowledge, can privately help a student to talk, can privately, even try to get the student to agree to bringing the parents in on a discussion with everybody. That's fine. And I have no problem with that. And I don't think reasonable people do. Uh, I think that people are confused, and they're conflating the two, confiding in a teacher and coming out under the teacher's guidance in front of the class, in front of the school. That's a very different thing.
okay? That's very helpful and makes a lot of sense to me. So, Barbara, when we look at the next steps around the adoption of the legislation, I realize that further consultations are going to be occurring. That process is going down the track, and I think you're right. Most sensible, in my opinion, parents would say, "Wow, this legislation makes a lot of sense. It's balanced, and it will really empower parents to be parents and respect and protect minors." But in this context, it also seems like the federal government wants to identify it really as a kind of a battleground for
Mhm.
kind of a wedge issue, if you call it cynically, a political wedge issue that will be used to kind of distinguish itself for its supporters opposed to the legislation. I think one of the ministers of the federal government even called it a so-called NATO moment, referring to the North American Treaty Organization, that somehow this was a call to mobilize all compassionate, right-thinking people against this legislation. Do you think that's kind of a dead end then, given the kind of survey that you've just outlined where most Canadians are at. Most Canadians are not on board with a kind of a radical situation where we kind of enable kids to change their gender.
Yes, I agree with you. I think it's a desperation move because, on so many issues, they're not making headway. The housing, immigration, like Polyev has been seeming to own a lot of the major issues that Canadians really do care about. And I see it as a desperation uh, move because I think Trudeau and his government have always played to the activists. I think they've mistaken what the activists want, as this is them being compassionate, compassionate government, compassion, and it's all about people who are disadvantaged. It's it's oppressed groups, and they've made that such a hallmark of their government. They can't back down on it. They have There's only one way to go for them, is to double down, because if they were to admit that they were too, I mean, it was Trudeau himself who announced out of the blue, uh, without even consulting his ministers a few years ago, when he said, "Oh yes, uh, men who identify as women, yes, they should be allowed to go into women's prisons, because they shouldn't." I mean, he didn't even think it out. So he's made this his issue in a very unthinking kind of way. I'm very convinced he has not personally seen any of the actual research. In the National Post last week was an op-ed by an endocrinologist at Montreal Hospital, Dr. Roy Epen, and it was such a measured, that laid out all the possible harms that can be done from early puberty blockers, laid out the statistics, that if you leave a child alone, you don't give them puberty blockers, the odds are about 80% that you're dealing with a child who is gay, who's been sort of groomed to think that if they have feelings that seem to be stereotypical of the opposite sex, then that must mean that they want to be there, or they are meant to be. Um, so we know from innumerable studies that, if you let a child go through puberty, the odds are about 80% that they will feel comfortable in the sex they were born. They may have a different sexuality than their parents thought, or wanted, but that's no reason not to let them kind of live their life before I mean, puberty blockers, they present a child with life altering changes to their bodies, including potential infertility. And 99% of children that take puberty blockers go on to cross sex hormones, which are far more likely to cause infertility. So the changes in a child's physical body are so immense, and also mental. We're finding out all the time more and more about the effects of puberty blockers on children. um, they're not harmless. Actually, Dr. Epen is one of the principals in a group called uh, First Do No Harm. you know um, and these are doctors who are pressing for more prudence and for more responsibility and less ideology in this entire field. And that's who our prime minister should be listening to, not the loudest voices from ideologues or from very um, uh, aggressive trans people themselves, for whom this battle is existential. They are not objective people.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It sounds like you're calling for wisdom when you use words such as prudence. And I think this is so apropos, Barbara, to our conversation as we think about how to make wise public policy decisions based on evidence and science and healthy debate and discussion. And I think caring leaders do that. And I think this is begs the question, if you're not kind of anchoring those decisions on truth or evidence, then it begs the question, why are we doing this? And it's occurred to me that one of the things that's happening or could be happening is this is often it's been said this is kind of a social contagion. It's kind of a fashionable thing to do. If you're kind of with it, then maybe you're open to kind of changing your gender. I don't know. I don't pretend to kind of know what is in people's heads. But I do wonder if that is a possibility, Barbara, that some of this is kind of a social contagion. I think what they mean by that is a kind of a trend within society. And too many politicians maybe go ahead with that as they try to be seen as caring, when in
Mhm.
fact, are you caring if what you're saying is not based on the truth, Barbara?
No, I think it is a social contagion. Those words have been applied to the gender issue for some time now. In her excellent book, uh, Irreversible Damage, a few years ago, which, by the way, got banned. I mean, it became a cause célèbre amongst. They hated it, and it was uh, about the fact that, especially amongst young girls who had reached puberty and who had never showed signs of gender confusion before, and suddenly they were, en masse discovering that they really were meant to be. And she goes through the whole process of how they were groomed in their minds by activism at school and gender ideologues for whom um, fluidity of gender is part of a whole transfer. It's a revolutionary approach to society as a whole to break down norms, and one of the biggest norms that they feel has to be broken down is the idea that there's such a thing as two sexes, and that gender fluidity is a norm. So when children learn this in school, their minds are very vulnerable. Especially since it's repeated on TikTok. One of one of the examples that she gave that stays with me from that book was, she said, it in terms of how kind of tenaciously children who glom onto this idea, and many of them, by the way, are autistic. We know that from many different studies. So once they glom onto this idea, it's very hard to shake their faith in that idea. And she showed that the same kind of children who are on board for gender confusion are also on board for anorexia, especially, I mean, girls especially. And you don't hear as much about anorexia as you once did, but in the 1990s, for example, anorexia was a social contagion, and there was no question that girls amongst themselves, it became a kind of thing. You'd see, girls friendship groups, they all got into this anorexia thing. But the most important thing that came out of her discussion about that was, she said, once you got into the social media aspect, and in the 1990s there weren't social media, but once it did, anorexia suddenly started appearing in places where it had never appeared before. She talked particularly about a whole, like a viral kind of infection in Japan, of all places, where actually the average child is quite small and petite. So you suddenly had girls in Japan who had never experienced anything like this, suddenly turning anorexic and going the whole, 9 yards with it. And that to me was one of the strongest pieces of evidence that I could see that it's, you use the word fashion, but fashion almost seems like something frivolous, like, oh yeah, um, a certain kind of shoes, or girls are all wearing like bows in their hair or something like that. That's fashion, but this is something much more insidious, of course, because it's invasive. It's a kind of invasion of your of your mind, and the taking over of your mind. It's so I find it a much more pernicious thing, and for adults to encourage children to uh, when they first hear about, you know what, I'm too fat, but darling, you're perfectly normal. Nobody ever says to a thin child who's refusing food, nobody ever says, Yes, dear, I can see. Yes, 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 you're too fat." They don't they don't affirm a child who is, harming their body, because we accept that anorexia is a disorder. Uh, and in terms of gender dysphoria, there are truly gender dysphoric children that cannot be denied, and they really can only be. It is a disorder, but they can only be made comfortable by transition. But let them do it when they're older. And if that's what they truly want, we can't stand in their way, and we shouldn't. And it might be just as much heartache for a parent of an 18-year-old, but at least they'll have the comfort of knowing that that child is now able to read books and to read, to make that decision somewhat on their own. Uh, but you cannot expect a 7, 8, 9-year-old child. It's not fair. It's not fair to assign them that level of responsibility and ability, the competency, mental competency, sufficient to medicalize them. And once you start medicalization, we know it's usually for life. This this to me is going to end up being one of the great scandals of human history, and I think Danielle Smith is going to hopefully live long enough to be able to say, "Well, at least I didn't succumb to it, and I did something about it," and good for her.
Indeed, good for her. So it begs the question then parents really need to look at this issue with great sensitivity and insight and truth. I think your overview is so helpful. It's something that you rarely hear in the mainstream media, and I think you really shine a wise light on this issue. So I think parents really need to speak up. It's interesting. There's a comment from our audience that said our education system really needs an overhaul. It really needs to focus on the ABCs or educational performance. That's really why they're there. So I think paradoxically, I mean, I think that there's the typical coalition of groups that are vehemently opposed to this legislation, as I understand, including the education union. So I think there's perhaps a great risk that they're kind of out on a branch, if you will, not really in touch with the
Mhm.
community or the science for that matter. So I'm wondering if there's a possibility that this will do a lot of damage to the trust that parents have in the public education system. And gosh, Barbara, I don't know. Maybe we need to. I know at Frontier we've written extensively about the benefits of vouchers that are used in countries like Sweden. So you empower parents to make the choice where you can send your children. But I
Yeah.
think this really begs a lot of questions regarding the trust in the public education system.
Well, there shouldn't be trust in the public education system because the this ideology has penetrated every single educational institution, every the teachers' unions, the school boards. There is no institutional group that has not been penetrated by activism, ideology. It's across the board. I so agree with you about vouchers. And one thing Alberta has that I wish all of Canada had was charter schools that have the right to spring up with very little red tape to go through. And that's what and absolutely what we need all across Canada is charter schools that are not beholden to curricula that are designed by a pedagogical system that is from top down from the schools that teach teachers, the educational schools, that they are marinated in Marxist pedagogy. They all read this book by Paulo Freire. Um, uh, what's the name of the book? Anyways, it's the book. He was a revolutionary Marxist who believed in revolution in the schools, total liberation of students. He treated them like as if they were, revolutionaries in the hills, like, fighting about. I mean, he wanted to totally upend all the schools and give the children free reign in every direction. Listen, honestly, parents have to trust their instincts. They have to. There's power in numbers. There's power in organization. They have to take back it. Schools are meant to be serving families. They are not meant to be serving ideological delusions and fantasies and the wish to virtue signal and to usher in a utopian world based on Marxist principles. That is not what we signed up for originally when we decided that we would have public education, was it? So we have to return. If public education is not going to go back to first principles, then parents have to have the right to choose other avenues to educate their children.
Totally agree, Barbara. I think that's really well said. It reminds me of another analysis that just came out. I think it was last week from StatsCan of all organizations regarding trust in
Mhm,
Canadian societies, both institutions and the media. And I did want to reflect briefly on the media because I think there's a dynamic going on here where a lot of what you talked about earlier, as I said, is I think very wise insights regarding the evidence and how do you really safeguard if you care about the wealth, the health and pardon me, the health and welfare of children. But this study from Stats Canada was interesting because it showed a significant. I was somewhat surprised how low the level of trust is by Canadians in the mainstream media.
mhm,
And just to summarize it quickly, you had 21% of Quebecers really had a fairly good confidence or trust in the media.
mhm,
And then in the West, on the prairies, it was 12%. Ontario was some 13% in Ontario and BC. And Atlantic Canada came in at 15%. So, when you look at some of these issues, I mean, it's amazing how little substance a lot of the mainstream media really conveys in what I believe is a balanced fashion regarding the arguments. Like, you never hear the mainstream media talking about how a lot of this is just all based on on the transgendered issue, out of bizarre cultural Marxist theories of queer theory. That's a specific
yeah.
theory that they use out of the universities. Like, this is right out of the bowels of the university, juxtaposed to the kind of the summary that you've mentioned that really comes out of evidence and research out of European jurisdictions that are really trying to come together and in a way that empowers parents, safeguards children, but also in a sensitive manner tries to realize that some people are confused about their gender and
Mhm,
they need support too. So,
mhm.
in this context, are you surprised how low those trust numbers are in the mainstream media?
I actually think it's in a way a sign of. It is low. I do find these figures very low, but in a way it's a healthy sign because so much of the media is untrustworthy in terms of objectivity. Uh, most, I mean, I have to always use the CBC as the prime example. CBC's mission has become to be a vehicle for unabashedly uh, politicized thinking and wishes. They are in the vanguard of advancing progressive ideas, and they the people that work for them are uniformly of the same opinion. So it's kind of like a closed shop uh, for left-wing thinking, and with very little giving the other side an opportunity as a public broadcaster. I mean, for example, the BBC is itself filled to the brim with left-wing thinkers, but their mandate from the government is that they are obliged to give airtime to the opposite, to if there's a debate going on and about whatever issue, they are obliged to give a certain amount of time to the opposite side. But the CBC does not. I don't know what their mandate says, but they certainly very rarely give airtime or writing time to, and even their own journalists have petitioned to be more. For example, on the Middle Eastern file, they've had their own journalists have signed petitions with hundreds and hundreds of them demanding that they be allowed to be biased in their reporting, that it's their right to be biased. So that doesn't bode well for the public broadcaster, and a lot of the other media equally. I think a lot of people now look. They do have an option. They can go online. They can choose any one of literally hundreds of thousands of podcasts, and look at us. Here we are having this conversation. It's not We're not doing it for a public broadcaster or for any broadcaster. It's your the Frontier Center wants to have interesting conversations that are not censored, or great, you can do it. And so do individuals. I read and support a lot of Substacks, for example, and I get a lot of my news from online, um, you know, either reportage or commentary, especially commentary from online magazines and individual Substack writers that I respect, and it's really enhancing, intellectually enriching. So I would be one of those people that say I don't trust most media. I can't say I don't trust all, because there are certain, I the publications that I work for, I trust. I read the Wall Street Journal every day. I trust the Wall Street Journal. Love their commentators, and I trust their news. So I guess we're in flux right now, media wise, because things are really still shaking out from the huge falling off the cliff of media following uh, the day when the internet ruined their ad revenues. Um, and we're still in recovery mode, I think. But things are starting to look a little more crystal clear, a little clearer than they were. I mean, 10 or 15 years ago, we were in, media was in free fall, wasn't it?
Hmm. Well, Barbara, I think that's a very good insight into the state of the media, and we need to pay attention to these surveys in this state of flux, as you said. But it also, I can tell you, there's still some very capable people in the media, and
Hmm.
certainly I enjoy reading your columns regularly, both in the Epoch Times, which is a terrific newspaper if you were not familiar with it, as well as the National Post has a lot of great insights, and other media, including on this network with the Miracle Network or MCA Media. So it's been delightful to have this far reaching conversation with you, Barbara. And I really do appreciate you sharing both your wisdom and your insights on these topics.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate the leisure we've had to explore these topics. It's not often you get more than a 2-minute soundbite, or and this is a real treat. It's a privilege and a luxury, I have to say, in terms of sharing views and ideas. So I thank you.
Well, thank you, Barbara, and thank you to our audience. We really appreciated the insightful questions and comments that you shared with us. And be sure to join us every Thursday for our live discussion. And I will tell you that we're there again. The audience feedback has been tremendous, and we're really grateful for that. And it's interesting. Tomorrow we're going to have another live discussion. It's a little bit of a special one as we mark the anniversary of the invocation, the use of the Emergency Measures Act, and we'll be having a conversation with senior fellow from Frontier, Ray McGinnis, who has researched this issue extensively. Um, it's fascinating that we had the court decision the other week naming the use of the act as unconstitutional. And we also want to talk about the Coots Four, the four gentlemen who served some 720 days without bail in confinement. So we'll catch up on that story as well, among others. So please be sure to join us tomorrow at 2 o'clock Central Time, 12 o'clock Pacific. And in the meantime, be sure to like us and share this with others. And we're so glad that you could join us today on Live with Barbara Kay, and have a terrific day. Thank you.